Here's something that should keep you up at night, or maybe help you fall asleep. I haven't decided which. We build monuments to presidents. We put their faces on mountains and currency. We name airports and libraries and aircraft carriers after them. We treat the presidency like it's some kind of golden ticket to immortality and prosperity, and yet a shocking number of them died broke. Not modest circumstances broke, not downsized the summer home broke. Actually, genuinely, sell everything at auction broke. Presidents who saved the Union, doubled the size of the country, wrote the Constitution, they died owing more money than most of us will ever see, leaving their families to beg Congress for charity just to avoid the poorhouse. So, tonight, we're going to count down the presidents who had the least money when they died. From the founding fathers who couldn't balance a checkbook, to war heroes who got scammed by con men, from the brilliant political minds who couldn't figure out basic economics, to the guys who just never had money in the first place. Before we start, if you enjoy falling asleep to the financial disasters of dead presidents, and honestly, who doesn't? Go ahead and subscribe. Hit that like button. Leave a comment about which presidential bankruptcy story resonates with your own financial anxiety. Now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's talk about the presidents who proved that even the most powerful job in the world doesn't guarantee you'll die with anything in the bank. Starting with a man who wrote about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness while drowning in a sea of debt he'd never escape. Thomas Jefferson. Let's start with something that sounds impossible. The man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who served as president, who founded the University of Virginia, and basically invented the idea of American intellectual life as we know it. That guy died broke. Not just a little short on cash. Completely, catastrophically, sell everything, including the people, you enslaved level of broke. Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, which is the kind of poetic timing that makes you wonder if he was just showing off. But here's what wasn't poetic. He owed over $100,000. In 1820s money, we're talking multiple millions in today's currency. The kind of debt that makes your stomach hurt just thinking about it. You have to understand, this wasn't some sudden financial crisis. Jefferson had been spending more than he earned for basically his entire adult life. Monticello, his famous estate, was gorgeous. It was also a money pit. He kept buying books, thousands and thousands of books, because he was genuinely obsessed with knowledge and learning. Which is admirable, sure, but you can't eat books. Well, you can, but it's not recommended. He bought wine. French wine specifically, because of course he did. The man spent years in Paris and came back with extremely expensive taste and a wine cellar that would make a sommelier weep with joy. He also had this habit of just giving things away, hosting elaborate dinners, playing the generous Virginia gentleman even when the account books were screaming for mercy. The really fascinating part is how methodical Jefferson was about everything else. This was a man who kept detailed records of when his peas bloomed, who designed his own architectural masterpieces, who could read in 7 languages. He tracked the weather obsessively. He invented things. He organized his books according to a system so complex, it would eventually become the basis for the Library of Congress classification system. And yet somehow, this same man looked at his finances and just hoped for the best. The plantation system itself was part of the problem. Jefferson's wealth was tied up in land and in enslaved people, which is its own moral catastrophe. But it was also economically unstable. Tobacco prices fluctuated wildly. Harvests failed. The soil in Virginia was becoming depleted from decades of intensive tobacco farming, which meant yields dropped even as expenses stayed the same. And Jefferson kept spending like tomorrow would somehow fix itself. He had this grand vision of Monticello as not just a home, but a kind of intellectual paradise. He kept expanding it, renovating it, adding that famous dome. Construction at Monticello went on for decades, literally decades. Workers, materials, constant changes to the design. All of it cost money that Jefferson increasingly didn't have, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. It was his life's work, his statement to the world, and somewhere along the way, it became an anchor, dragging him down financially. There were other expenses too. Jefferson co-signed loans for friends and family members, which is something you should never do, but especially not when you're already drowning in debt. When those people couldn't pay, guess who got stuck with the bill? He also had this slightly delusional belief that his reputation and connections would somehow translate into financial stability. Like creditors would just forgive debts because he was Thomas Jefferson. They did not. His personal library alone was legendary. After the British burned the original Library of Congress during the War of 1812, Jefferson sold his personal collection of about 6,500 books to the government for $23,000. That sounds like a lot, but Jefferson had spent far more acquiring those books over decades. And then, because he apparently couldn't help himself, he immediately started buying more books to rebuild his collection. The man had a problem. When he died, his estate was so deeply mortgaged that there was no saving it. Monticello had to be sold. His possessions were auctioned off in 1827. Everything from furniture to scientific instruments to farming equipment. People came from all over to pick through the belongings of a founding father. And yes, the enslaved people he owned were sold too. Families separated to pay off his debts, which is one of those historical facts that sits in your chest like a stone. Jefferson spent his life writing about liberty while building his comfort on a system that made that liberty impossible for hundreds of people. And in the end, even that system couldn't keep him solvent. His daughter Martha and her children were left with almost nothing. They had to rely on the generosity of friends and eventually some financial relief from Congress. But that came later, after the humiliation of watching everything sold at auction. Martha spent years afterward living modestly, a far cry from the elegant life at Monticello. Here's the thing that gets me. Jefferson knew this was coming. He watched the debt pile up year after year. He wrote letters about it, worried about it, tried to manage it. In 1819, he wrote to a friend describing his financial situation as desperate. But he never actually changed his behavior. He kept spending, kept building, kept living like a man who had money he didn't have. It's such a human thing, honestly. The gap between knowing you should change and actually changing. There's also something almost tragic about the timing. Jefferson and John Adams both died on the same day, July the 4th, 1826. Adams' last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives," not knowing that Jefferson had died a few hours earlier. It's this beautiful, poignant moment of connection between two old friends and rivals. Except while Adams died solvent, leaving his family in reasonable shape, Jefferson died leaving chaos and debt. So the author of the Declaration of Independence, the man who doubled the size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase, the guy whose face is on Mount Rushmore, he died functionally insolvent, leaving his family to pick up the pieces. His legacy is complicated in so many ways, and his financial disaster is just one more layer of complexity. It's the kind of irony that would be funny if it weren't so sad, and if it didn't reveal something fundamental about how even brilliant people can make the same mistakes over and over again. And speaking of presidents who maybe should have hired an accountant, let's talk about the guy who came after Jefferson's generation and somehow managed to be even worse with money, though for completely different reasons. James Monroe. James Monroe is one of those presidents who did everything right according to the script. He served his country faithfully for decades. He fought in the Revolutionary War, got shot at the Battle of Trenton, actually. took a musket ball to the shoulder and nearly bled out on the frozen ground while Washington's army pushed forward across the icy Delaware River. He was 18 years old. 18. That's younger than most college sophomores. And he was bleeding out in the snow for a country that didn't technically exist yet. He survived, studied law under Thomas Jefferson, served as a diplomat in France, Spain, and Britain, became Secretary of State, then Secretary of War, and finally President for 2 terms. The Monroe Doctrine is literally named after him. You probably learned about it in school and immediately forgot it, but it was a big deal, basically telling European powers to stay out of the Americas or else. His presidency was called the Era of Good Feelings, which is such a quaint name it almost makes you nostalgic for a time when political eras had names that didn't sound like dystopian novels. And yet, when Monroe died on July the 4th, 1831, another 4th of July death, which was apparently just a thing presidents did back then, he was nearly bankrupt. Not quite as spectacularly broke as Jefferson, but close enough to make you wonder if there was something in the water at Monticello. Here's what happened. Monroe spent his own money. A lot of it. During his years of diplomatic service in Europe, he was expected to maintain a certain lifestyle. You couldn't show up to meet with European royalty looking like you'd just walked out of a Virginia cornfield. You needed nice clothes, a nice residence, the ability to host dinners and receptions. The problem was that the U.S. government's reimbursement system was, to put it charitably, a complete disaster. Monroe would submit expense reports and then just wait and wait. Sometimes the government would pay him back partially, sometimes not at all. Sometimes they'd argue about whether certain expenses were really necessary. Was that chandelier for the diplomatic residence actually needed? Or was Monroe just being fancy? Did he really need to serve wine at that dinner with French officials? Or could he have gotten away with water? The bureaucratic nitpicking was endless. Meanwhile, Monroe was covering everything out of pocket because the work still needed to be done. The United States was a young country trying to establish itself on the world stage, and Monroe was one of its faces in Europe. He couldn't exactly show up to negotiations looking like a pauper. So he spent his own money and trusted that eventually, the system would work. He bought furniture for diplomatic residences. He paid for official entertainment. He covered travel costs. He purchased gifts for foreign dignitaries because that's what you did in diplomatic circles. And he did this for years, assuming, reasonably, you'd think, that his government would eventually make him whole. They didn't. Not fully, not even close. The expenses added up in ways that are almost comical if you don't think too hard about the human cost. Monroe served as Minister to France from 1794 to 1796, then as Minister to Britain from 1803 to 1807, then as a special envoy to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. Each posting required him to maintain households, staff, carriages, appropriate clothing. The expected lifestyle of a diplomatic representative was expensive, and Monroe bore most of that cost personally. By the time Monroe left the presidency in 1825, he was in serious financial trouble. He'd spent 40 years in public service, and it had ruined him financially. He spent the last years of his life petitioning Congress for reimbursement, submitting documentation, basically begging to be paid back for money he'd spent serving his country. He compiled detailed records. Monroe was nothing if not thorough, showing exactly what he'd spent and why. Congress did eventually grant him some relief, about $30,000 in 1826, but it wasn't enough. Not even close. The debates in Congress were brutal. Some members argued that Monroe had been extravagant, that he'd lived beyond what was necessary. Others pointed out that he'd served his country faithfully and deserved to be made whole. In the end, they compromised. which in government speak means nobody was happy and the problem wasn't actually solved. Monroe had to sell his plantation, Highland, just to cover debts. Then he sold Oak Hill, his other estate. These weren't just properties, they were his life's work, his legacy, the physical manifestation of everything he'd built. And they went to strangers to pay off debts incurred while serving his country. He moved in with his daughter Maria and her husband in New York because he couldn't afford to maintain his own household. This is a former president we're talking about, a founding father, a man who'd been shot for his country, who'd negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, who'd served in virtually every major office the young republic had to offer. And he died essentially dependent on family charity, living in someone else's house. The really bitter part? Monroe wasn't irresponsible. He wasn't buying French wine by the caseload like Jefferson or building architectural vanity projects. He was spending money on legitimate government business, trusting that the system would work the way it was supposed to. And it just didn't. The system failed him completely. His wife Elizabeth had died the year before, in 1830, and Monroe followed her on July 4th, 1831, becoming the third president to die on Independence Day. He was 73 years old, living in someone else's house, still waiting for the country he'd served to fully pay him back. He was so poor at the end that there wasn't enough money for an elaborate funeral. He was buried in New York, far from Virginia, far from the plantation lands he'd lost. There's something particularly cruel about Monroe's financial ruin because it wasn't the result of personal excess. It was the result of public service. He went broke doing his job, following the rules, being the person his country needed him to be. And while Congress eventually acknowledged the debt, they did it slowly, reluctantly, and incompletely. Just enough to ease their conscience, but not enough to actually fix the problem. Monroe's story is a reminder that sometimes the system punishes the people who serve it most faithfully. He did everything right. Fought, served, sacrificed, and died nearly bankrupt anyway. It's not a story about personal failure. It's a story about institutional failure, about a government that asked everything of its servants and gave back just enough to avoid total embarrassment. So Monroe died nearly bankrupt. A man who'd given everything to his country and received a partial refund in return. It's the kind of story that makes you wonder how many other people throughout history have been quietly ruined by systems that promised to support them. But at least Monroe's poverty came from service and systemic failure. Our next president's financial collapse came from something much more American, much more devastating, and honestly much more preventable. Getting absolutely fleeced by someone he trusted. Ulysses S. Grant. Here's a question that should keep you up at night. What do you do when you've saved the entire country and then lose everything to a con man? Ulysses S. Grant was a legitimate American hero. Not in the mythological sense, but in the actual verifiable sense. He won the Civil War. That's not hyperbole. He was the commanding general of the Union Army, the man who finally figured out how to beat Robert E. Lee, the person who accepted Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865. He then served 2 terms as president from 1869 to 1877, navigating the impossible mess of Reconstruction. And then, less than a decade after leaving the White House, he was completely broke, penniless, destitute, racing against death itself to write a book that might save his family from poverty. The story of how this happened is almost too perfectly American to believe. After his presidency, Grant went on a world tour that lasted over 2 years. He was treated like royalty everywhere he went. England, France, Egypt, India, China, Japan. Crowds gathered to see the man who'd saved the Union. It was triumphant. It was also expensive. And when Grant returned to the United States, he needed to figure out how to make money. This is where things get sad. Grant was a brilliant military strategist. He was decent at being president, all things considered. But he was absolutely terrible at understanding business, and he knew it. He said so himself repeatedly, and yet somehow he kept trusting people who told him they could make him rich. In 1880, Grant moved to New York City. His son Buck had become business partners with a man named Ferdinand Ward. Ward was young, charismatic, persuasive, everything a successful financier should be. He claimed to have special connections on Wall Street, insider knowledge, can't miss opportunities. He told Grant that if the former president invested with their firm, Grant and Ward, they could all make enormous profits. Grant invested. He put in $100,000, essentially his entire life savings. Other people, trusting Grant's name and reputation, invested too. Ward told everyone they were making spectacular returns. The books showed profits of almost $700,000. Grant believed him. Why wouldn't he? Ward seemed legitimate. The numbers looked good, and Grant's own son was involved. Here's the thing about con men. They're really good at being con men. That's literally their job. Ward was running what we'd now call a Ponzi scheme, paying early investors with money from new investors, creating fake profits on paper while actually just moving money around. And Grant, who could outthink Confederate generals, who could manage armies of hundreds of thousands of men, who could navigate the politics of Reconstruction, Grant couldn't see it. In May of 1884, the whole thing collapsed. Ward had been borrowing enormous sums of money using the firm's reputation, which really meant using Grant's reputation as collateral. When the debts came due and there was no money to pay them, everything imploded overnight. Grant and Ward declared bankruptcy. Grant personally owed about $150,000, money he absolutely did not have. The former president of the United States, the man who'd saved the Union, woke up one morning to discover he was ruined. Everything was gone. The house, the investments, the savings. He couldn't even pay his household staff. Grant had to borrow money from friends just to buy groceries. William Vanderbilt, the railroad magnate, gave Grant $150,000 as a loan, or maybe as charity disguised as a loan, because everyone knew Grant would never be able to pay it back. But wait, it gets worse. Around the same time Grant discovered he was broke, he also discovered he was dying. Throat cancer. He'd been a cigar smoker his entire adult life, sometimes going through 20 cigars a day. By early 1885, the cancer was bad enough that he could barely speak, could barely eat. The pain was constant. And this is where Grant did something extraordinary. He decided to write his memoirs. Not because he wanted to, but because he needed to. Mark Twain, yes, that Mark Twain, offered Grant a deal to publish the memoirs through his company. Twain promised Grant's family would receive 70% of the profits, which was an incredibly generous royalty rate. Grant accepted. So picture this: a dying man, broke, in constant pain, sitting in his study day after day, writing. His doctors had given him morphine for the pain, but he tried to use as little as possible because he needed his mind clear to write. He wrote in longhand, page after page, racing against his own mortality. When the cancer made it too painful to sit, he wrote lying down. When it became too painful to hold a pen, he dictated to a stenographer. Grant was writing 10,000 words a day sometimes. 10,000 words. While dying of throat cancer. While broke. While knowing that if he didn't finish, his wife Julia and their children would be left with nothing. The memoirs are extraordinary, by the way. Clear, honest, detailed accounts of the Mexican War and the Civil War. No self-aggrandizement, no embellishment. Just Grant telling the truth as he remembered it. Military historians still consider them among the finest military memoirs ever written. Grant had the same clarity in prose that he had had in military strategy: direct, efficient, devastating. He finished the manuscript in July of 1885. He died a week later on July 23rd at age 63 at a cottage in upstate New York where he'd gone hoping the mountain air might help. It didn't. But he'd finished the book. And here's the redemption part. The memoirs were a massive success. They sold 300,000 copies in the first 2 years. Mark Twain's company paid Julia Grant nearly $450,000 in royalties, about $15 million in today's money. It was one of the best-selling books of the 19th century. Grant had literally written his family out of poverty from beyond the grave. But let's sit with the tragedy for a moment. This was a man who'd served his country at the highest levels, who'd preserved the Union, who'd tried to protect the rights of formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction. And he died broke because he trusted the wrong person, because he didn't understand business, because the system that had elevated him provided no real safety net when he fell. Grant's last months were spent in a race between death and the written word, fighting to leave his family something, anything, to live on. He won that race, barely. But he shouldn't have had to run it at all. And speaking of presidents who deserve better, let's talk about a guy who didn't even get the chance to mess up his finances properly, because he died after 31 days in office. William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison has the unfortunate distinction of being remembered primarily for dying, which is a bit unfair because he had a whole life before that. But when you die 31 days into your presidency, it tends to overshadow everything else. Harrison was born into Virginia aristocracy in 1773. His father signed the Declaration of Independence. The family had money, land, all the markers of colonial elite status. But here's the thing about being from a big plantation family in early America. When you're not the oldest son, you don't inherit the estate. The oldest son gets everything: the land, the house, the enslaved people, all of it. Everyone else has to figure out their own path. So Harrison went into the military. He fought in the Indian Wars of the 1790s, became the governor of the Indiana Territory, and made his real reputation at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, fighting against a confederation led by the Shawnee leader Tecumseh. The battle was messy and the victory questionable, but Harrison got credit for it anyway, and Tippecanoe became his nickname. Later, during the War of 1812, he won the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh was killed. These military victories made Harrison a national figure. But military glory doesn't pay the bills. Not consistently, anyway. Harrison spent years in public service, as a territorial governor, as a congressman, as a senator, and none of these positions made him wealthy. The territorial governor job paid about $2,000 a year, which sounds like nothing now and wasn't great then either, especially for a man trying to maintain a lifestyle befitting his family name. Harrison and his wife, Anna, had 10 children. 10. That's a lot of mouths to feed, a lot of clothes to buy, a lot of educations to fund. Harrison owned land in Ohio, including a farm called Grouse Land, but he was never a particularly successful farmer. The land was worth something on paper, but it wasn't generating the kind of income needed to support a large family in comfort. He also had a habit of co-signing loans for friends and relatives, which we've already established is a terrible idea. When those people couldn't pay, Harrison was stuck with the debt. This happened multiple times. You'd think he'd learn, but apparently not. The man could strategize military campaigns, but couldn't figure out that lending money to unreliable people was a bad investment. By the time Harrison ran for president in 1840, he was not wealthy. The famous log cabin and hard cider campaign portrayed him as a man of the people, a simple frontier farmer. This was partly political branding. His opponent was portrayed as an out-of-touch elitist, but it wasn't entirely false. Harrison really did live fairly modestly compared to some of his contemporaries. He needed the presidential salary. The 1840 campaign was wild, by the way. It was one of the first modern presidential campaigns with slogans, songs, mass rallies. Tippecanoe and Tyler too is one of the most famous campaign slogans in American history, which is impressive considering it's essentially just two guys' names and the word two. Harrison campaigned hard, giving speeches across the country, trying to prove at age 67 that he was vigorous enough for the job. He won. He was inaugurated on March 4th, 1841. It was cold and wet. Harrison gave the longest inaugural address in American history, 1 hour and 45 minutes, over 8,000 words, without wearing a coat or hat because he wanted to appear robust. He rode to the ceremony on horseback instead of in a carriage. He was trying to project strength, vitality, frontier toughness. 3 weeks later, he got sick. The exact cause is debated. Some historians think it was pneumonia. Others think it was typhoid fever from contaminated water in the White House, which apparently had sewage issues. The White House water supply came from a spring that was downstream from public sewage, which is exactly as gross as it sounds. Either way, Harrison's health collapsed rapidly. His doctors tried everything they knew, which in 1841 meant bleeding him, giving him opium, applying heated suction cups to his skin, and administering calomel, a mercury compound that definitely didn't help and probably made things worse. Harrison died on April 4th, exactly 31 days after taking office. He was the first president to die in office, and for over a century he held the record for shortest presidency. Anna Harrison never even made it to Washington. She'd stayed in Ohio, planning to join him after the weather improved. She found out her husband was president, and then about a month later found out he was dead. She received a congressional widow's pension of $25,000, which Congress granted after Harrison's death. Without that pension, she would have been in serious financial trouble. Harrison's estate was modest. The farm in Ohio, some land. Not much liquid wealth. His children inherited what there was, which wasn't enough to make any of them rich. One of his sons, John Scott Harrison, became a congressman. One of his grandsons, Benjamin Harrison, became the 23rd president. But William Henry Harrison himself died without having accumulated any significant wealth, despite decades of public service and a famous family name. Here's what gets me about Harrison's story. He spent his entire adult life serving his country in one capacity or another. Military service, territorial governance, Congress, the Senate, the presidency. He fought wars, negotiated treaties, governed territories, and at the end of it all, he left his family with limited assets and a reliance on congressional charity. Harrison's death was so sudden that he didn't have time to put his affairs in order, to make provisions, to do any of the things you're supposed to do when you know the end is coming. He went from vigorous campaigning to dead in less than 2 months. His family was left sorting through the financial aftermath while also grieving. The limited estate wasn't the result of extravagance or bad investments or con men. It was just the reality of public service in early America. The positions didn't pay that well. Land wealth was unstable, and if you had a big family and a commitment to maintaining a certain social standing, the money went out as fast as it came in. So Harrison died with limited assets, his wife dependent on a congressional pension, his children inheriting enough to get by but not enough to be secure. It's not as dramatic as Grant's collapse or as catastrophic as Jefferson's debts, but it's its own kind of quiet financial failure, a life of service that never translated into security. And if you think dying after 31 days in office is rough, wait until you hear about the president who owned plenty of stuff, but almost none of it was actually useful when he died. Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor was a professional soldier who spent 40 years in the military before anyone thought to make him president. And honestly, he seemed about as surprised as everyone else when it happened. Taylor was born in 1784 in Virginia, but his family moved to Kentucky when he was an infant, so he grew up on the frontier. He joined the Army in 1808 and just stayed there for decades. He fought in the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, the Second Seminole War, and finally the Mexican-American War, where he became a national hero by winning a series of battles against larger Mexican forces. The thing about Taylor is that he looked like someone's uncle who got lost on the way to a barbecue. He was short, stocky, dressed casually, and frequently sat on his horse sideways because apparently that was more comfortable. His nickname was Old Rough and Ready, which tells you everything about his personal style. He was not a polished, aristocratic general. He was a practical, no-nonsense soldier who got results. The Whig Party nominated him for president in 1848, basically because he was popular and electable, not because he had any political experience or even particularly strong political opinions. Taylor had never voted in a presidential election before running in one. He didn't even know he'd been nominated, at first because the notification letter arrived postage due, and Taylor refused to pay for mail he hadn't requested. Someone had to send it again with prepaid postage. He won anyway, because military heroes almost always won in 19th century America. Taylor took office in March of 1849. Completely unprepared for the political nightmare of slavery debates and sectional tensions that dominated his presidency. But let's talk about his money situation, because it's weird in a very specific way. Taylor wasn't poor. He owned land. He owned plantations in Louisiana and Mississippi. He owned over 100 enslaved people, which made him one of the larger slaveholders to serve as president. On paper, Taylor was wealthy. The problem was that all his wealth was tied up in assets that were fundamentally illiquid and unstable. Land and enslaved people weren't like having money in a bank account. You couldn't just sell a plantation quickly if you needed cash. The value fluctuated based on cotton prices, weather, crop yields, and 1,000 other variables. And while enslaved people were treated as property in the grotesque economics of the time, they represented a form of wealth that required constant management, oversight, and expense. You had to feed people, clothe them, provide minimal shelter, deal with illness and injury. It was a morally bankrupt system that was also economically precarious. Taylor spent most of his military career moving from post to post, living on his army salary, which was decent but not extravagant. His wife Margaret, known as Peggy, and their children followed him to various frontier forts, living in military housing, dealing with the constant relocations that came with army life. They weren't living in poverty, but they weren't living in luxury either. The plantations were managed by overseers while Taylor was away with the military, which is never a great system. Overseers got paid to produce profits, which meant they had every incentive to drive enslaved people harder and reinvest as little as possible in the property itself. Taylor's plantations made money sometimes, lost money other times, and required constant attention that Taylor couldn't always provide while serving in the military. When Taylor became president, he was worth something on paper, probably around $200,000 in total assets, which was substantial. But how much of that could he actually access? How much of it was liquid? Not much. He owned land that would take months to sell. He owned enslaved people, which in the moral horror of that economic system represented wealth that was tied to their labor and couldn't be easily converted to cash without selling human beings at auction, which is exactly as monstrous as it sounds. Taylor's presidential salary was $25,000 a year, which was actually useful money, cash he could spend. But he only got to collect it for 16 months because in July of 1850, Taylor died suddenly after attending a 4th of July celebration at the Washington Monument, which was under construction at the time. The story goes that Taylor spent hours in the hot sun listening to speeches and then cooled off by consuming large quantities of iced milk, cold cherries, and raw vegetables. He got sick almost immediately, severe cramping, fever, all the symptoms of acute gastroenteritis. His doctors treated him with the usual nightmare battery of 19th century medicine, bloodletting, mercury compounds, opium. Taylor died 5 days later, on July 9th, 1850. For years, people speculated that Taylor had been poisoned, probably because the illness came on so suddenly and killed him so quickly. In 1991, his body was actually exhumed and tested for arsenic. The test came back negative. Taylor most likely died from cholera or typhoid fever, both of which were rampant in Washington, D.C.'s disgusting water supply, or from simple food poisoning. Either way, it was quick and brutal. When Taylor died, his wife Peggy was left with those plantations and enslaved people and land, assets that looked impressive on paper but weren't easy to manage or convert to usable wealth. She lived another 2 years, dying in 1852. The estate was divided among their children, who inherited the same problem their father had: wealth that was mostly theoretical. The Taylor family plantations continued to operate until the Civil War destroyed the entire economic system they were based on. When slavery ended, the plantations lost most of their value overnight. The land was still there, but without enslaved labor to work it, the economic model collapsed. The Taylor family descendants ended up with land that was worth a fraction of what it had been valued at when Zachary died. Here's the thing about Taylor's financial situation. He wasn't broke, exactly. But his wealth was trapped in a system that was both morally horrific and economically unstable. He couldn't access most of it easily. He couldn't convert it to cash without significant effort and loss of value, and when he died suddenly, his family inherited assets that required expertise and luck to manage successfully. Taylor's story is different from Jefferson's debt spiral, or Grant's con man disaster, or Harrison's modest circumstances. Taylor had wealth, but it was the wrong kind of wealth. Immobile, complicated, tied to an economic system built on human suffering that would collapse within 15 years of his death. He was asset rich and cash poor, which is a precarious position to be in when you die unexpectedly. So Taylor died with property and enslaved people and land that added up to something on paper, but didn't translate to security for his family. His widow and children had to navigate the complicated process of managing plantations and eventually selling them in a market that was heading toward the catastrophic disruption of the Civil War. It's yet another example of how wealth in early America was fragile, how even presidents who seemed financially stable on paper were one bad breakaway from their families struggling. Taylor didn't die broke, but he died without the kind of liquid, accessible wealth that would have given his family real security. And speaking of presidents whose finances were complicated by the broader political catastrophe of slavery and civil war, let's talk about the man who held the country together and still couldn't quite hold his own finances together: Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is probably the most famous president in American history, which makes it easy to forget that for most of his life, he was just a guy trying to make ends meet. Lincoln was born in 1809 in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky. And yes, that's actually true, not campaign mythology. His family was poor. His father Thomas was a farmer and carpenter who moved the family from Kentucky to Indiana to Illinois, chasing better land and better opportunities. Lincoln grew up doing farm labor, reading by firelight, teaching himself mathematics and grammar and law. He was largely self-educated, which is remarkable, but it also meant he had no family wealth, no inheritance, no safety net. Everything Lincoln achieved, He built himself from absolutely nothing, which is inspiring, sure, but it also meant that money was always tight. Lincoln worked as a rail splitter, a flatboatman, a store clerk, a postmaster, a surveyor. He studied law on his own and became a lawyer in 1836. He was apparently a pretty good lawyer. He handled thousands of cases over his career, everything from property disputes to murder trials. He rode the judicial circuit in Illinois, traveling from county to county, sleeping in boarding houses and taverns, building a reputation. But being a country lawyer in Illinois in the 1840s and 50s wasn't exactly lucrative. Lincoln made a decent living, enough to support his family modestly, but he wasn't getting rich. His law partner, William Herndon, later described their practice as successful but not especially profitable. They handled a lot of small cases for small fees. Lincoln was known for being honest and fair, which is great for your reputation, but not always great for your bank account. In 1842, Lincoln married Mary Todd, who came from a wealthy Kentucky family. This was a step up socially, but it didn't translate to financial security for Lincoln. Mary's family didn't approve of the marriage. They thought Lincoln was beneath her, and they certainly weren't funding the couple's lifestyle. Lincoln and Mary lived in a rented room for a year before buying a small house in Springfield in 1844 for $1,500. They had 4 sons: Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas. Edward died at age 3. William died at age 11 while Lincoln was president. Thomas, called Tad, died at age 18, just a few years after his father's assassination. Only Robert lived to adulthood. The medical expenses and emotional toll of losing children was something Lincoln and Mary both carried, and the financial strain of raising a family on a lawyer's income was constant. Lincoln served one term in Congress from 1847 to 1849, which paid $8 a day while Congress was in session. It was fine money, but not transformative. After his term ended, Lincoln went back to practicing law in Illinois. He turned down offers for government positions that would have paid more, but required him to move or give up his law practice. He was cautious about money, conscious of the need to provide for his family. The presidency came almost out of nowhere. Lincoln emerged as the Republican candidate in 1860, partly because he was moderate enough to appeal to different factions and unknown enough that he had fewer enemies than the frontrunners. He won the election, the South seceded, and Lincoln spent the next 4 years trying to hold the country together through the worst crisis in its history. The presidential salary was $25,000 a year, which was real money, but Lincoln didn't get to enjoy it in any normal sense. He was managing a civil war. His son Willie died in the White House in 1862, probably from typhoid fever contracted from the same contaminated water supply that had killed 2 previous presidents. Mary Lincoln spiraled into depression and started spending money compulsively, redecorating the White House, buying expensive clothes, running up debts that embarrassed and stressed her husband. Lincoln himself lived frugally. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't have expensive hobbies. His main indulgence was buying books, and even that was modest. He wore the same black suits until they were shabby. He was famously unpretentious, accessible, willing to meet with regular citizens who showed up at the White House wanting to talk, but he wasn't accumulating wealth. The presidential salary covered their living expenses and Mary's spending, with not much left over. Lincoln made some small investments. He owned some land in Illinois, but nothing substantial. When he was assassinated on April 14th, 1865, by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater, he left an estate valued at around $85,000. That included his house in Springfield, his law office contents, some government bonds, and personal effects. $85,000 sounds like a lot, but it wasn't. Not really. Not for a widow and 2 surviving sons to live on indefinitely. Mary Lincoln was left financially insecure. She had this compulsive spending habit, depression, grief, and a fixed amount of money that wouldn't last if she wasn't careful. And she wasn't careful. Mary tried to sell her old clothes and jewelry to raise money, which became a public scandal. The widow of the martyred president selling her belongings was seen as embarrassing and undignified. She traveled to Europe partly to live more cheaply. She lobbied Congress for a pension, which she eventually received in 1870, $3,000 a year, increased to $5,000 in 1882. But the fact that she needed to lobby for it at all shows how precarious her situation was. Robert Lincoln, the oldest son, became a successful lawyer and eventually served as Secretary of War and Minister to Britain. He did fine financially. But his mother struggled for years, financially and emotionally, before dying in 1882 in her sister's house in Springfield, the same city where she'd started her married life 40 years earlier. Lincoln's financial modesty is interesting because it was so clearly a choice in some ways. He could have made more money as a lawyer if he'd focused purely on lucrative cases. He could have pursued wealth more aggressively. But he was more interested in politics, in ideas, in the moral questions of slavery and union. Those interests led him to the presidency and to greatness, but they didn't lead him to financial security. When Lincoln died, he left his family in what we might call comfortable but precarious circumstances. The estate was enough to live on if managed carefully, but not enough to ensure long-term security, especially for a widow with Mary's psychological struggles and spending habits. Congress had to step in with a pension to prevent the widow of the great emancipator from falling into poverty, which is both a generous gesture and an indictment of the system. Lincoln saved the Union, ended slavery, redefined American democracy, and gave some of the most beautiful speeches in the English language. And he died leaving his wife financially insecure, dependent on congressional charity to maintain a middle-class existence. It's not a story of bankruptcy or dramatic collapse, but it's a story of how even the most consequential presidents weren't guaranteed financial security for their families. And if you think that's rough, wait until you hear about the guy who got shot 4 months into his presidency and left his family in similar circumstances. James A. Garfield. James A. Garfield had one of those classic American success stories. Born in poverty, self-educated, worked his way up from basically nothing to the presidency, and then he got shot in a train station by a guy who thought he deserved a government job. The whole thing is depressing in about 6 different ways. Garfield was born in 1831 in a log cabin in Ohio. His father died when James was only 2 years old, which left his mother Eliza to raise 4 children alone on a frontier farm. They were genuinely poor. Not modest circumstances poor, actually poor. Garfield worked as a canal boat driver as a teenager, nearly drowned once, got sick with malaria, and decided maybe he should try something else with his life. He managed to get an education through a combination of working, borrowing money, and sheer determination. He attended the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, later called Hiram College, and then Williams College in Massachusetts. He worked as a janitor to pay for school. He taught classes to earn money. He borrowed from friends and family. By the time he graduated, he owed money to half of Ohio, but he had a degree. Garfield became a teacher, then a college president at age 26, then got into politics. He served in the Ohio State Senate, then joined the Union Army during the Civil War and became a major general. He was elected to Congress while still in the Army and served in the House of Representatives for 17 years. He was good at it. Smart, articulate, well-read, genuinely interested in policy. He married Lucretia Rudolph in 1858. They had 7 children, though 2 died in childhood. That's 5 surviving children to feed, clothe, educate, and provide for. Congressional salary in the 1860s and 70s ranged from $5,000 to $7,500 a year, which was decent money but not extravagant when you're supporting a large family in Washington, D.C. Garfield supplemented his income by practicing law on the side and by carefully investing in land and stocks. He was financially cautious, even conservative. He'd grown up poor, and he was determined not to be poor again. But he wasn't accumulating massive wealth either. He bought a small farm in Ohio called Lawnfield, though the family jokingly called it the farm of poverty, because it required constant work and investment. The 1880 Republican Convention was a mess. The party was split between factions, nobody could agree on a candidate, and after 36 ballots, they settled on Garfield as a compromise. He hadn't even been seeking the nomination. He'd gone to the convention to support someone else and came home as the presidential nominee. He won the general election in November and was inaugurated in March of 1881. He'd been president for exactly 4 months when Charles Guiteau shot him. Guiteau was a deeply troubled man who'd convinced himself that he deserved to be appointed as a consul to France, despite having no qualifications whatsoever. When Garfield's administration ignored his increasingly unhinged letters demanding the position, Guiteau decided that killing the president was the logical next step. The logic here is non-existent, but Guiteau was not operating on logic. On July 2nd, 1881, Garfield was walking through the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C., with his Secretary of State, James Blaine, about to leave for a vacation. Guiteau walked up behind him and shot him twice, once in the arm, once in the back. Garfield collapsed. Guiteau was immediately arrested, apparently surprised that people weren't celebrating him for his service to the nation. Here's the thing. Garfield probably would have survived if his doctors had just left him alone. The bullet that hit his back lodged near his spine but didn't hit any vital organs. It wasn't immediately fatal, but his doctors couldn't find the bullet, so they kept probing the wound with unsterilized instruments and their bare, unwashed fingers. This was 1881. Germ theory was known but not universally accepted yet, and American doctors were especially slow to adopt antiseptic practices. Alexander Graham Bell even came to the White House with a metal detector he'd invented to try to locate the bullet. It didn't work, partly because nobody thought to move Garfield off the bed, which had metal springs that interfered with the detector. So they never found the bullet, and the doctors kept probing, and the wound kept getting infected. Garfield lingered for 79 days. He lost 100 pounds. The infections were everywhere. He was in constant pain. They moved him to a seaside cottage in New Jersey in September, hoping the ocean air might help. It didn't. He died on September 19th, 1881. Not really from the gunshot, but from the infections his doctors had inadvertently given him while trying to treat it. When Garfield died, Lucretia, called Crete by her family, was left with 5 children ranging in age from 9 to 20 and an estate that was modest. Garfield had some savings, the farm in Ohio, a few investments. The total value was somewhere around $30,000. That might sound like a lot, but it wasn't enough to support a widow and 5 children indefinitely, especially not to the standard expected of a presidential family. Think about the expenses. The children needed educations, college tuition, books, living costs. Lucretia needed to maintain a household, pay staff, cover medical expenses, buy food and clothing. The income from Garfield's investments and the farm wasn't enough to cover it all. She was facing the very real possibility of having to significantly downgrade her family's lifestyle or run through the modest inheritance in just a few years. Congress, to their credit, acted relatively quickly this time. They granted Lucretia an annual pension of $5,000, the same amount they'd eventually given Mary Lincoln. $5,000 a year was enough to live on, but barely. It meant the family wouldn't fall into poverty. But it also meant they'd have to be careful with every expense. Lucretia also received proceeds from a public fundraising campaign that raised over $360,000, about $10 million in today's money. Americans were genuinely outraged by Garfield's assassination and sympathetic to his widow, so they donated generously. This money, combined with the congressional pension, gave Lucretia actual financial security. But here's what's striking. Without that public charity and congressional pension, the widow of a murdered president would have been in serious financial trouble. Garfield had done everything right, according to the traditional American narrative. He'd worked hard, educated himself, served his country with distinction, saved carefully, invested wisely, and it still wasn't enough to ensure his family's security after his death. Garfield had been president for 6 months and 15 days. He'd been actively working for about 4 of those months before getting shot. He'd collected 4 months of presidential salary, a little over $8,000 total. That was not enough time to accumulate presidential-level wealth, or even to significantly improve his financial position. Lucretia lived until 1918, eventually moving back to the farm in Ohio, which she turned into a memorial to her husband. She raised her children, saw them educated and settled, outlived 2 of them. The public fundraising and congressional pension allowed her to live comfortably, but it was charity, not the natural result of Garfield's own financial planning. The children did reasonably well. One son became a lawyer, another became a professor, another worked in business. But their security came partly from their mother's frugal management of the pension and fundraising money, not from any great inheritance from their father. Garfield's financial story is less dramatic than Grant's total collapse or Jefferson's catastrophic debt, but it's telling in its own way. This was a man who'd been financially responsible his entire life, who'd worked multiple jobs, who'd invested carefully, who'd avoided debt, and he still left his family in a position where they needed government and public assistance to avoid hardship. The fact that Garfield was murdered makes it more tragic, but the underlying issue was systemic. Presidential salaries weren't high enough to allow for significant savings while supporting a large family. Public service positions generally didn't pay enough to accumulate real wealth, and there was no automatic pension or support system for presidential widows and children. It depended on congressional generosity and public sympathy. So Garfield died leaving limited means, and his family survived on a combination of his modest savings, congressional pension, and public charity. It was enough, but only barely, and only because people felt bad that he'd been murdered. It's not exactly a ringing endorsement of the system. And speaking of presidents who came from humble origins and never really escaped them financially, let's talk about the guy who took over after Lincoln was assassinated and somehow made everyone mad at him. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson never had a chance, financially or otherwise. He was born into poverty in 1808 in North Carolina. And when I say poverty, I mean real, grinding, absolutely nothing poverty. His father Jacob died when Andrew was 3, leaving the family destitute. His mother Polly worked as a weaver and took in laundry to keep her children alive. They lived in a 2-room shack. There was no money for school, no money for anything. Johnson was apprenticed to a tailor at age 10. Not learned a useful trade, apprenticed. More like legally bound servant, apprenticed. He ran away at age 15, technically breaking his apprenticeship contract, which made him something like a fugitive. He eventually settled in Tennessee, still working as a tailor, still poor, still barely literate. He married Eliza McCardle when he was 18 and she was 16. Eliza could read and write, which Johnson couldn't do fluently yet, and she helped teach him. Think about that. The man who would eventually become president of the United States was taught to read by his teenage wife. He continued working as a tailor, eventually opened his own shop in Greenville, Tennessee, and slowly, very slowly, built a modest life. The tailor shop became a kind of political gathering place. Johnson would work on suits and coats while discussing politics with customers and neighbors. He was good at the work, meticulous, skilled with his hands, and he used those long hours of stitching and measuring to educate himself about government, law, and the issues of the day. It's almost absurdly American when you think about it. A barely literate apprentice runaway teaching himself politics while hemming trousers. Johnson got into local politics, serving as an alderman, then mayor, then state representative, then senator, then governor, then U.S. senator. He was a Democrat from Tennessee who supported the Union when the Civil War started, which made him extremely unusual. When Tennessee seceded, Johnson stayed in the Senate, the only Southern senator to do so. Lincoln appointed him military governor of Tennessee in 1862, and then picked him as vice president in 1864 to create a unity ticket. The choice of Johnson as vice president was politically strategic, but personally disastrous. Lincoln wanted to appeal to border states and war Democrats by choosing a Southern Unionist. Johnson made sense on paper. In reality, he and Lincoln had almost nothing in common beyond supporting the Union. Johnson was crude, often drunk, resentful of Eastern elites, and deeply opposed to civil rights for formerly enslaved people, despite his unionism. Johnson had been vice president for exactly 6 weeks when Lincoln was assassinated. Suddenly, this Taylor from Tennessee, this self-educated man who'd grown up in a 2-room shack, was president of the United States during Reconstruction. It went about as badly as you'd expect. Johnson fought constantly with Congress over Reconstruction policy. He vetoed civil rights legislation. He opposed the 14th Amendment. He was so obstructionist that the House of Representatives impeached him in 1868. He survived removal by 1 vote in the Senate. Senator Edmund Ross of Kansas cast the deciding vote to acquit, destroying his own political career in the process. Johnson served out his term as basically a lame duck president with no real power or support, and then went back to Tennessee. But let's talk about his finances, because Johnson never had any money, ever, his entire life. The tailor shop in Greenville provided a modest income, enough to support his family in a simple lifestyle, but nothing approaching wealth. His various political positions paid salaries, but Johnson never used those positions to enrich himself. He wasn't corrupt. Whatever his many faults, financial corruption wasn't among them. This is worth emphasizing because it would have been easy for Johnson to profit from his positions. Plenty of politicians did. But Johnson maintained a kind of stubborn integrity about money, even while being obstructionist about everything else. He took his salary and nothing more. No sweetheart land deals, no insider trading on government contracts, no mysterious consulting fees. He was honest in his financial dealings even when he was wrong about nearly everything else. Johnson owned some property in Tennessee, including his house and the building that had housed his tailor shop. He made some small investments, but he never accumulated significant wealth. Part of this was his background. He'd grown up with nothing and never really developed the skills or mindset for financial accumulation. Part of it was his personality. Johnson was stubborn, principled in his own way, and not particularly interested in money for its own sake. The presidency didn't change his financial situation much. He collected his salary, $25,000 a year, and used it to support his family and maintain the household. His wife Eliza was chronically ill with tuberculosis and rarely appeared in public, so they didn't do much entertaining. They lived quietly, almost reclusively, in the White House. The social events that might have enhanced Johnson's reputation or political standing just didn't happen, partly because Eliza was too sick and partly because Johnson had alienated most of Washington anyway. When Johnson left office in 1869, he went back to Tennessee with about the same amount of wealth he'd had before becoming president. He tried to return to politics, running for Senate and losing twice before finally winning a Senate seat in 1875. He served for a few months before dying of a stroke on July 31st, 1875, At age 66, Johnson's estate was valued at around $50,000, which included his house, his land, some stocks and bonds, and personal property. $50,000 was not nothing, but it wasn't much for a man who'd served as president and senator. It was enough for his widow Eliza to live on modestly for the few months she survived him. She died in January of 1876. The Johnson children inherited what little there was. None of them became wealthy. The family remained solidly middle class, maybe lower middle class by elite standards. Johnson's legacy was complicated. He's generally ranked among the worst presidents for his opposition to civil rights and his impeachment. But financially, his legacy was simple. He died without major assets or savings. What's interesting about Johnson's poverty is that it was consistent throughout his life. He started poor, stayed poor to modest, through decades of public service, and died poor by elite standards. There was no dramatic financial collapse, no con man stealing his savings, no sudden crisis, just a lifetime of not having much money and never really acquiring any. Johnson never seemed particularly bothered by this. He'd grown up in such extreme poverty that having a house and enough to eat probably felt like success. He wasn't trying to build wealth or establish a financial dynasty. He was just trying to get through each day, each political fight, each crisis. His ambitions were political, not financial. He wanted respect, vindication, recognition. Money was just a means to survival, not an end in itself. The contrast with someone like Jefferson is striking. Jefferson died massively in debt despite coming from wealth and living in luxury. Johnson died modestly solvent despite coming from nothing and living simply. Jefferson's financial disaster was a tragedy of excess and poor judgment. Johnson's financial modesty was just his life. He never had money, never expected to have money, and died without money. Congress didn't grant Eliza Johnson a pension. There was no public fundraising campaign. Johnson was too controversial, too disliked, too associated with the failures of Reconstruction. His widow just lived quietly on the modest estate he'd left until she died a few months later. The Johnson children divided up the property and went on with their lives, carrying the complicated legacy of a father who'd risen from absolute poverty to the presidency and still ended up with almost nothing to show for it financially. So Andrew Johnson died poor by elite standards, having never accumulated significant wealth despite serving in virtually every level of government, from alderman to president. It's not a story of financial catastrophe, but it's a story of how public service in 19th century America didn't guarantee financial security, especially if you started from nothing and never figured out how to use your positions for financial gain. Or perhaps more accurately, if you refused to use those positions for financial gain out of a sense of integrity that didn't extend to your political positions. And if you think starting from poverty and ending modestly is rough, let's talk about a guy who actually started with some advantages and still managed to lose most of his wealth through bad timing and worse luck. Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren is one of those presidents who gets lost in the shuffle of history, overshadowed by the giants who came before and after him. But he had one of the more interesting financial trajectories of any president. He actually made money, accumulated real wealth, and then watched a significant chunk of it evaporate through a combination of bad investments and terrible economic timing. Van Buren was born in 1762 in Kinderhook, New York, to a family that owned a tavern. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't destitute either. Solid middle class, respectable, stable. Van Buren became a lawyer, got into New York politics, and proved to be exceptionally good at the political game. He was charming, strategic, skilled at building coalitions and making deals. People called him the Little Magician because of his political maneuvering, and also because he was only 5 feet 6 inches tall. He also had other nicknames that tell you everything about his political style: the Red Fox of Kinderhook, because of his reddish hair and cunning, and Martin Van Ruin after the economic crash, which was less affectionate. Van Buren was the kind of politician who could work a room, build alliances, and get things done through sheer political skill rather than force of personality or military glory. He was a backroom dealer in the best and worst senses of that term. He served as a New York State Senator, as Attorney General of New York, as a U.S. Senator, as Governor of New York for about 3 months before resigning to become Secretary of State under Andrew Jackson, then as Vice President under Jackson, and finally as President from 1837 to 1841. That's a remarkably successful political career. And unlike some of his predecessors, Van Buren actually made money from his law practice. He was a successful attorney in New York, handling important cases, building a client base, investing his earnings wisely. By the time he became president, Van Buren was genuinely comfortable financially. He owned property in New York, had investments in various ventures, and had accumulated what historians estimate was around $200,000 in wealth, several million in today's money. Van Buren was also known for his refined tastes, which cost money but enhanced his reputation. He wore expensive clothes, served fine wines, maintained an elegant household. His critics accused him of being effete and aristocratic, which was somewhat ironic given that he was the son of a tavern keeper. But Van Buren had cultivated this image deliberately. He understood that appearance mattered in politics, that looking successful helped you become successful. Van Buren also had the distinction of being the first president born as an American citizen rather than a British subject, which is a fun piece of trivia, but not particularly relevant to his finances. What is relevant is that he became president just in time for one of the worst economic disasters in American history. The Panic of 1837 hit about 2 months into Van Buren's presidency. It was a financial crisis caused by a combination of factors: speculative lending, paper money inflation, Jackson's policies toward the national bank, crop failures, and economic problems in Britain that rippled across to America. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment soared. The economy went into a depression that lasted for years. Van Buren's response to the crisis was basically to do nothing. He believed in limited government intervention in the economy, so he opposed relief measures and stimulus programs. He thought the economy would correct itself naturally. It did not. Or at least it took a very long time, during which thousands of people lost their jobs, homes, and savings. This made Van Buren deeply unpopular, and he lost his re-election bid in 1840 to William Henry Harrison in one of the most lopsided elections in American history. The Whig campaign against Van Buren was brutal and effective. They portrayed him as an out-of-touch elitist living in luxury, while ordinary Americans suffered. They published pamphlets describing the fancy furniture in the White House, the imported wines, the elegant dinners, all the trappings that Van Buren had cultivated as markers of success suddenly became evidence of his disconnection from regular people. Meanwhile, they portrayed Harrison as a simple frontier farmer in a log cabin drinking hard cider, which was almost entirely false but made for great politics. But the economic crisis also affected Van Buren personally. He had investments in banks and businesses that failed during the panic. He owned real estate that plummeted in value as the economy collapsed. He didn't lose everything. Van Buren was too financially savvy for that. But he lost a lot. His comfortable wealth became significantly less comfortable. The irony is thick enough to cut with a knife. Van Buren refused to intervene in the economy to help ordinary people, partly based on principle and partly based on the belief that government shouldn't pick winners and losers. But when his own investments failed in that same economic collapse, there was no one to bail him out either. He lived his principles, and his principles cost him a significant portion of his wealth. After leaving the presidency, Van Buren retired to his estate called Lindenwald in Kinderhook, New York. He tried to run for president again in 1848 on the Free Soil Party ticket, an anti-slavery party, but lost badly. He spent the rest of his life as a gentleman farmer, writing his autobiography, receiving visitors, and watching his fortune slowly decline. Van Buren made some additional bad investments later in life. He put money into railroad ventures that didn't pan out. He invested in companies that failed. Some of this was bad luck. The mid-19th century economy was volatile, and even smart investments could go south quickly. Some of it was probably overconfidence. Van Buren had been successful for so long that he may have stopped being as careful as he should have been. The railroad investments were particularly painful. Railroads were the hot new technology of the mid-1800s, the equivalent of tech stocks in the 90s. Everyone wanted in on railroad companies, convinced they'd make fortunes as the country expanded westward. Van Buren invested in several railroad ventures that either failed outright or returned far less than projected. The companies went bankrupt, merged, or just never laid the track they'd promised. Van Buren's money vanished into the dirt where railroads were supposed to be built, but never were. He also spent money maintaining Lindenwald and living the lifestyle expected of a former president. Entertaining guests, maintaining staff, keeping up the property. All of this cost money, and Van Buren's income from his remaining investments wasn't always enough to cover it. He never went broke, but the comfortable wealth he'd had at his peak gradually eroded. Van Buren's wife, Hannah, had died in 1819, years before he became president, so he was a widower for most of his political career. He had 4 sons who survived to adulthood, and he expected them to be financially self-sufficient, which they mostly were. He didn't leave them a fortune, but he didn't leave them in debt either. When Van Buren died in 1862 at age 79, his estate was worth significantly less than it had been at its peak. Estimates vary, but he probably left somewhere between $70,000 and $100,000. Still a respectable sum, but a far cry from the $200,000 or so he'd been worth during his political prime. The decline was gradual, the result of market downturns and bad investments, rather than any dramatic catastrophe. Van Buren's sons inherited Lindenwald and the remaining assets. They sold the estate eventually. It's now a National Historic Site, which Van Buren probably would have found amusing. The family remained comfortable, but not wealthy. Van Buren's legacy was political rather than financial, and even his political legacy is mixed. He's remembered as a skilled politician who happened to be president during an economic disaster, and as a man who had money and lost a good portion of it to circumstances partly beyond his control. What's interesting about Van Buren's financial decline is how ordinary it was. No con men, no catastrophic debts, no dramatic collapses. Just a man who made money, invested it, and watched some of those investments fail as the economy churned through boom and bust cycles. It's the kind of financial erosion that happens to lots of people. You're doing fine, then the market crashes, or your investments underperform, or you spend a little more than you should on lifestyle expenses, and gradually your wealth shrinks. Van Buren was smart enough not to lose everything, but not lucky enough or cautious enough to preserve his peak wealth. He died in declining financial circumstances, still solvent, but significantly less wealthy than he'd once been. It's a quieter kind of financial failure than some of the others on this list, but it's failure nonetheless. The failure to maintain what you've built, to adapt to changing circumstances, to know when to hold and when to fold. His story is a reminder that even financial success isn't permanent, that wealth can erode slowly through 1,000 small decisions and market movements, that being smart and successful doesn't guarantee you'll stay that way. Van Buren built a fortune through skill and hard work, and then watched a significant portion of it disappear through a combination of bad luck, bad timing, and the simple ongoing expenses of maintaining the lifestyle he'd worked so hard to achieve. And speaking of holding and folding, let's talk about a founding father who inherited a mess and never quite figured out how to clean it up. James Madison. James Madison was the father of the Constitution, the architect of the Bill of Rights, Jefferson's closest collaborator, and a two-term president who guided the country through the War of 1812. He was also the guy who inherited his father's debt-heavy plantation system and spent the rest of his life trying unsuccessfully to make it profitable. Madison was born in 1751 to a prominent Virginia family. His father, James Madison Sr., owned a large plantation called Montpelier in Orange County, Virginia, along with dozens of enslaved people. The Madisons were part of the Virginia gentry, wealthy on paper, influential, socially prominent. But like a lot of Virginia plantation wealth, it was more complicated than it looked. Madison was short, 5 feet 4 inches, even shorter than Van Buren, and sickly as a child. He wasn't expected to do physical labor, so he got an education instead. He attended the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton, and became one of the most intellectually formidable figures in early American history. He knew philosophy, political theory, history, law. He was brilliant. Everyone agreed on that. He was also chronically anxious and probably suffered from what we'd now recognize as panic attacks or severe anxiety disorder. Madison would have episodes where he couldn't speak in public, where his body would shut down under stress. He learned to manage it, to push through it, but it was always there. The idea that this small, nervous, perpetually worried man became one of the most influential political thinkers in history is remarkable. The idea that he also had to manage a failing plantation while dealing with all of this makes it even more complicated. He married Dolly Payne Todd in 1794 when he was 43 and she was 26. Dolly was charming, socially skilled, and became one of the most popular first ladies in American history. She was also a widow with a son from her first marriage, which Madison accepted and helped raise. They had no children together. Dolly was everything Madison wasn't. Outgoing, vivacious, beloved by everyone who met her. She wore elaborate turbans and colorful dresses at a time when most women dressed more modestly. She served ice cream at the White House, which was exotic and exciting in the early 1800s. She saved the portrait of George Washington when the British burned Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812, becoming a national hero in the process. She was, by all accounts, absolutely delightful. She was also expensive, not in a frivolous way exactly, but maintaining her social position, hosting the events that made her famous, dressing appropriately for her role, all of that cost money. Money that the plantation wasn't reliably generating. Madison's political career was distinguished. He served in the Virginia legislature, the Continental Congress, the Constitutional Convention, the House of Representatives, as Secretary of State under Jefferson, and finally as president from 1809 to 1817. He was involved in every major political development of the founding era. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Madison took detailed notes of every session, creating the most complete record we have of how the Constitution was written. He did this while also actively participating in debates, drafting proposals, building coalitions. It was an extraordinary intellectual achievement. Those notes would eventually be worth something. Congress paid Dolly for them after Madison's death. But during his lifetime, they were just more unpaid work. But here's the thing about Madison's finances. He inherited Montpelier and the enslaved people who worked it. And the whole operation was already in financial trouble when it became his responsibility. Tobacco farming in Virginia was becoming less profitable as the soil became depleted from decades of intensive cultivation. The plantation economy was built on enslaved labor, which is morally monstrous, but it was also increasingly economically unstable. The tobacco had literally exhausted the soil. You can only grow the same crop on the same land for so long before the nutrients are depleted and yields start dropping. Virginia planters had been growing tobacco on the same fields for over a century by the time Madison inherited Montpelier. The land was tired, yields were declining, and yet the entire economic and social system was built around this exhausted model. Madison tried various schemes to make Montpelier profitable. He experimented with crop rotation, tried growing wheat instead of tobacco, attempted scientific farming methods. Nothing really worked. The plantation required constant investment in tools, in maintenance, in the minimal provisions for enslaved people, and the returns kept declining. He corresponded with other gentlemen farmers, read agricultural treatises, tried implementing new theories about soil management and crop diversity. Madison approached farming the same way he approached everything else, intellectually, systematically, with careful research and planning. And it still didn't work because the fundamental problem wasn't Madison's methods. The problem was the system itself. Part of the problem was structural. The Virginia plantation system was fundamentally broken. It required enormous capital to maintain. It depleted the land. It depended on the labor of people who had every reason to work as little as possible since they received no benefit from their labor. And it produced crops whose prices fluctuated wildly based on international markets. It was a system designed to extract wealth in the short term while destroying value in the long term. Think about the economics for a moment. You own land and enslave people. The enslaved people work the land. Growing crops you sell for profit. But the enslaved people need food, clothing, shelter, medical care, minimal versions of these things, but still expenses. The land needs tools, seeds, maintenance. The crops are subject to weather, disease, market fluctuations. And the people doing the actual work have no incentive to be efficient or productive because they receive nothing for their labor except the avoidance of punishment. It's a system that only works, morally and economically, if you're willing to be brutal. If you minimize expenses to the absolute bare minimum, if you work people to exhaustion, if you ignore long-term consequences for short-term profit. Some planners did this and made money, at least for a while. Madison either couldn't or wouldn't embrace that level of exploitation fully, and so the plantation struggled. Madison also had the same bad habit as Jefferson. He lived like a wealthy gentleman even when the income didn't support it. Montpelier needed to be maintained in a style befitting a former president. Guests needed to be entertained. The Madisons employed numerous staff, paid staff for the house, enslaved people for the fields, all of which cost money. Dolly in particular was known for her entertaining and hospitality, which enhanced Madison's reputation but drained his finances. Former presidents in that era were expected to receive visitors, to provide hospitality to anyone of sufficient social standing who showed up. And people showed up constantly at Montpelier. Politicians, foreign dignitaries, old friends, distant relatives, curious travelers, they all expected to be housed and fed, often for days or weeks. Madison and Dolly couldn't turn them away without seeming rude or falling in social standing. So they hosted everyone, maintaining the fiction of prosperity, even as the account books showed mounting problems. When Madison left the presidency in 1817, he retired to Montpelier and tried to focus on making it profitable. It didn't work. The expenses kept exceeding the income. Madison sold off parcels of land to raise cash. He sold some of the enslaved people, separating families in the process, which adds another layer of moral horror to the financial failure. Nothing was enough to make the numbers work. Imagine being James Madison, understanding that slavery is morally wrong, He knew this, he wrote about it, he struggled with it, but being financially trapped in a system built on enslaved labor and then having to sell human beings to break apart families, not out of cruelty, but out of financial desperation. The moral weight of that must have been crushing. Dolly's son from her first marriage, Payne Todd, was also a financial disaster. Payne was charming but irresponsible, ran up enormous gambling debts, drank heavily, and constantly needed money. Madison repeatedly bailed him out, paying off debts, providing allowances, essentially subsidizing Payne's destructive lifestyle. It was a financial drain that Madison could not afford, but felt obligated to cover. Payne would disappear for months, show up with massive debts, promise to reform, and then do it all again. He gambled in Philadelphia, in New York, in Washington. He borrowed money using Madison's name as collateral. He ran up bills at hotels and taverns, and Madison, whether out of love for Dolly or sense of familial obligation or simple inability to say no, kept paying. By the time Madison died on June 28, 1836, at age 85, Montpelier was heavily mortgaged and financially underwater. His estate was worth something on paper: land, enslaved people, property, but the debts exceeded the assets in practical terms. Dolly inherited a mess. Madison's death itself was relatively peaceful. He'd been in declining health for years, but remained mentally sharp until nearly the end. He refused to take stimulants that might have prolonged his life by a few hours or days, saying he wanted to die naturally. His last recorded words were to his niece, who asked him something at breakfast. He said, "I always talk better lying down," and then he just stopped breathing. For someone who'd lived such an intellectually intense life, it was a remarkably quiet exit. She tried to hold on to Montpelier, but couldn't manage it financially. She sold the plantation in 1844 for $13,000, far less than it was supposedly worth, but all she could get in a forced sale. She moved back to Washington, D.C. and lived in a house provided by friends and supporters. Congress eventually granted her a $25,000 payment for Madison's papers and notes from the Constitutional Convention, which helped. But Dolly spent the last years of her life in financial strain. The sale of Montpelier must have been devastating. This was the house where Dolly had been First Lady in her own way, where she'd hosted countless dinners and events, where she'd built her reputation, and she had to sell it to a stranger, watch it pass out of the family, know that generations of Madison history were being erased for $13,000 that wouldn't even cover all the debts. She also continued to support Payne Todd, who kept accumulating debts and draining whatever money she had. When Dolly died in 1849, she left virtually nothing. The woman who'd been one of the most celebrated first ladies in American history, the wife of the father of the Constitution, died in near poverty in a borrowed house. Dolly's final years were marked by a kind of quiet dignity in the face of financial disaster. Friends and admirers helped her. Congress gave her a seat in the House gallery for life. People treated her with respect and affection. But she was essentially living on charity, dependent on the kindness of others, a former First Lady reduced to accepting handouts. And Payne Todd, the source of so much financial drain, outlived her by only a few years, dying broke and alone. Madison's financial story is particularly frustrating because he was brilliant in every other way. He understood complex political theory, could navigate intricate diplomatic negotiations, helped design the entire structure of American government, but he couldn't figure out how to make a plantation profitable. Or maybe he understood that the plantation system itself was broken, but couldn't escape it. The financial strain Madison experienced wasn't primarily about personal excess. It was about inheriting a fundamentally flawed economic system and lacking the ruthlessness or the luck to extract profit from it anyway. Other plantation owners made money by working enslaved people harder. investing less in maintenance, cutting every corner. Madison either couldn't or wouldn't do that to the same degree, and so the plantation slowly failed. There's a certain tragic irony in Madison's situation. He helped create a political system designed to protect property rights and promote economic growth, but he couldn't make that system work for his own property. He understood government and law at the deepest levels, but couldn't solve the practical problem of making a farm profitable. His intellectual gifts, so useful in political theory, were almost useless in the face of exhausted soil and an economically unsustainable agricultural model. Madison's reliance on family support toward the end is telling. He didn't die destitute, but he died knowing that Montpelier was financially unsustainable and that Dolly would inherit a losing proposition. And in fact, within a decade of his death, she'd lost everything: the plantation, the financial security, all of it. So Madison died strained financially, despite a lifetime of distinguished service and intellectual achievement. The plantation system that had supported his family for generations was collapsing, and he couldn't stop it. His legacy was constitutional and political, not financial. And his wife, despite her charm and social success, ended up dependent on congressional charity and friends' generosity, much like the widows of other failed presidential estates. It's another example of how even the most brilliant minds couldn't necessarily translate that intelligence into financial security, especially when trapped in an economic system that was morally corrupt and increasingly unstable. Madison helped build American democracy and died leaving his widow in financial distress. The irony is depressing. The father of the Constitution couldn't solve the problem of his own financial constitution. The architect of American government couldn't architect a sustainable economic model for his own household. It's the kind of failure that makes you wonder about the limits of intelligence, about how even genius has boundaries, about how some systems are so broken that even the smartest people can't fix them from the inside. And speaking of brilliant minds who struggled financially, let's talk about another founding father who lived frugally his entire life and still didn't leave much behind: John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams had one of the most impressive resumes in American history, which makes it even more remarkable that he died without significant wealth. This was a man who served as a diplomat, senator, secretary of state, president, and then, in the most interesting career move of all, went back to Congress as a regular representative for 17 years after his presidency. And through all of that distinguished service, he never got rich. Adams was born in 1767 to John Adams and Abigail Adams, which meant he was basically born into American political royalty. His father was a founding father who became the second president. His mother was one of the most intelligent and politically engaged women of her era. Young John Quincy grew up surrounded by the people who were literally inventing American government. He had an extraordinary education. At age 10, he traveled to Europe with his father on a diplomatic mission. He studied in Paris, Amsterdam, and Leiden. He served as a secretary and translator for American diplomats while still a teenager. He spoke French fluently and later learned Dutch, German, and Russian. By the time he was 20, he'd seen more of the world and received more education than most people experienced in a lifetime. Adams became a lawyer, then a diplomat himself. He served as minister to the Netherlands, to Prussia, to Russia, and to Britain. He was a senator from Massachusetts. He was Secretary of State under James Monroe, where he was instrumental in formulating the Monroe Doctrine and negotiating the acquisition of Florida from Spain. Then he was elected president in 1824 in one of the most controversial elections in American history. The 1824 election was a mess. No candidate won a majority of electoral votes, so the decision went to the House of Representatives. Adams won despite Andrew Jackson having more popular votes and more electoral votes initially. Jackson's supporters accused Adams and Henry Clay of making a corrupt bargain. Clay threw his support to Adams, and Adams then made Clay his Secretary of State. Whether it was actually corrupt or just normal political dealing is debatable, but it poisoned Adams' presidency from the start. Adams served one term, lost badly to Jackson in 1828, and then did something almost no other president has done. He went back to regular politics. In 1831, he was elected to the House of Representatives from Massachusetts, and he served there until he literally died at his desk in 1848. He had a stroke while voting on the House floor, was carried to the Speaker's room, and died 2 days later saying, "This is the last of earth. I am content." But let's talk about money, because Adams never had much of it despite this incredible career. Part of this was his personality. Adams was intensely moralistic, almost puritanical in his frugality. He believed public service was its own reward and viewed the accumulation of wealth as vaguely distasteful. He lived simply, dressed plainly, avoided extravagance. His diplomatic posts paid salaries, but they weren't lucrative, and Adams often spent his own money on official expenses that weren't fully reimbursed. Sound familiar? It's the same pattern as Monroe. American diplomats were expected to maintain certain standards, and the government reimbursement system was unreliable at best. Adams did practice law occasionally and made some money from legal work, but he was more interested in public service than building a practice. The presidency paid $25,000 a year, which was good money, but Adams served only one term. 4 years of presidential salary while supporting a household and maintaining the expected lifestyle didn't leave much for savings. After losing the presidency, Adams could have retired comfortably to Massachusetts and lived off whatever he'd saved. Instead, he went back to Congress, which paid $8 a day when Congress was in session, far less than the presidential salary. He did this because he felt he still had work to do, particularly fighting against slavery. Adams became one of the most vocal opponents of slavery in Congress, arguing case after case, presenting anti-slavery petitions despite the House's gag rule that tried to prevent discussing them. Adams lived in a house in Washington during congressional sessions and at the family home in Quincy, Massachusetts, during breaks. The Quincy house, which his father had called Peacefield, and which later generations called the Old House, was comfortable but not grand. It was a gentleman's home, appropriate for a distinguished family, but not a mansion. His wife, Louisa Catherine Adams, came from a prominent family. Her father was a wealthy merchant, but that wealth didn't translate into significant inheritance for Louisa or support for the Adams family. John Quincy and Louisa had 3 sons, one of whom died as an infant. The other 2, George and John, both struggled with alcoholism and depression. George died by suicide in 1829 at age 28, possibly jumping from a steamboat. John died in 1834 at age 31. The third son, Charles Francis Adams, survived and had a successful career, but the loss of 2 children was devastating emotionally and financially. Funerals, debts the sons had accumulated, family support. When Adams died in 1848 at age 80, his estate was valued at around $100,000. That sounds substantial, but it included the house in Quincy, books, personal property, and some investments. It wasn't poverty, but it wasn't wealth either. Not for someone who'd served at the highest levels of government for over 40 years. Louisa lived another 4 years, dying in 1852. She was supported by the estate and by her surviving son, Charles Francis. Congress didn't grant her a pension. Adams was too controversial, too associated with anti-slavery politics that Southern congressmen hated, and besides, he'd served only one term as president. What's striking about Adams' financial situation is how deliberate it was. He could have made more money. He could have pursued business opportunities, leveraged his fame and connections, built wealth the way other prominent men did, but he chose not to. He chose public service, chose to fight against slavery in Congress, chose to live frugally and simply. Adams kept detailed diaries his entire adult life, thousands of pages documenting his thoughts, activities, and observations. He swam in the Potomac River nearly every morning for exercise, even as an old man. He was disciplined, intellectual, driven by principle rather than profit. And he died modestly wealthy, leaving his family secure but not rich. His frugality and focus on service over wealth were admirable in their way, but they also meant that despite one of the most distinguished careers in American history, Adams didn't leave behind financial security that matched his intellectual and political legacy. He lived by his principles, and his principles didn't prioritize money. It's a different kind of financial modesty than we've seen with other presidents, not the result of disaster or bad luck, but the result of choosing other priorities. Adams valued service, intellectual engagement, and moral causes over financial accumulation. And so he died without significant wealth, by choice as much as by circumstance. And speaking of men who lived simply and didn't accumulate wealth, let's talk about a president who came from actual poverty and never really rose above modest circumstances despite reaching the highest office. Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore has the dubious distinction of being one of the most forgotten presidents in American history, which is a shame because his personal story is actually pretty remarkable. He went from grinding poverty to the presidency and then back to comfortable but not wealthy obscurity, and through it all, he remained basically decent in his financial dealings, which is more than you can say for a lot of people. Fillmore was born in 1800 in a log cabin in the Finger Lakes region of New York. And when I say log cabin, I mean actual frontier poverty, not the romanticized campaign version. His family were tenant farmers, which meant they didn't even own the land they worked. They were one step above indentured servants. Fillmore's father couldn't read or write. The family had virtually nothing. At age 14, Fillmore was apprenticed to a clothmaker. This wasn't a nice professional apprenticeship. It was basically child labor, working long hours in terrible conditions for no pay except room and board. Fillmore taught himself to read during this time, buying a small dictionary and learning words whenever he had a spare moment. Think about that. He taught himself to read as a teenager while working full-time in a mill. He eventually bought his way out of the apprenticeship. His father scraped together $30 to free him from the contract, and Fillmore became a teacher. He taught school while studying law on his own, the same way Lincoln did. He passed the bar in 1823 and started practicing law in Buffalo, New York. Fillmore married Abigail Powers in 1826. Abigail had been his teacher when he was 19 and she was 21, which is slightly awkward but was apparently fine by early 19th century standards. She was educated, cultured, and helped further Fillmore's own education. They had 2 children who survived to adulthood. Fillmore got into politics through the Anti-Masonic Party, which was exactly what it sounds like. A party opposed to the Freemasons, who they thought had too much secretive power. It's one of those weird third-party movements that made sense at the time and seems bizarre in retrospect. Fillmore served in the New York State Legislature, then in Congress, then as Comptroller of New York, then as Vice President under Zachary Taylor. When Taylor died in July of 1850 after 16 months in office, Fillmore became president. He served out the remaining 2 years and 8 months of Taylor's term, presiding over the Compromise of 1850, which temporarily diffused the crisis over slavery in new territories by making a bunch of concessions to both sides that satisfied no one and delayed the Civil War for a decade. Fillmore's financial situation throughout all of this was modest. His law practice in Buffalo was successful enough to support his family comfortably, but he never became wealthy from it. He wasn't handling the kind of high stakes corporate cases that made lawyers rich. He was doing county court work, property disputes, basic legal services for regular people. His various political positions paid salaries, but again, nothing spectacular. The vice presidency paid $5,000 a year. The presidency paid $25,000. Fillmore served less than 3 years as president, so he collected less than $75,000 in presidential salary total. Some of that went to running the household, supporting his family, maintaining appearances. Abigail Fillmore died in March of 1853, less than a month after they left the White House. She'd caught a cold at Franklin Pierce's inauguration. It was freezing that day, and she stood outside for hours and developed pneumonia. She was 55 years old. Her death was devastating to Fillmore emotionally, and it also complicated his financial situation because he'd expected they'd retire together and live off their modest savings. Fillmore eventually remarried in 1858 to a wealthy widow named Caroline Carmichael McIntosh. Caroline was independently wealthy, which significantly improved Fillmore's financial security. They lived comfortably in Buffalo in a mansion that Caroline had inherited. But it's important to note that this wealth came from Caroline's first husband, not from anything Fillmore had accumulated himself. Fillmore dabbled in various business ventures after the presidency. He invested in local Buffalo companies, served on some corporate boards, made some money from those activities, but he never became seriously wealthy. He lived comfortably in Buffalo, traveled to Europe once, stayed involved in civic affairs. He opposed Lincoln during the Civil War, not supporting the Confederacy exactly, but thinking Lincoln was too aggressive, which damaged his historical reputation. When Fillmore died in 1874 at age 74, after suffering a stroke, his estate was valued at perhaps $100,000. Some of that was his own accumulated savings and investments, some was Caroline's wealth. It's hard to separate the two completely, but it's clear that Fillmore's personal financial accumulation over a lifetime of work and public service was limited. His children, a son and a daughter, inherited portions of the estate, but neither became wealthy from it. They lived comfortable middle-class lives. Fillmore's legacy was civic rather than financial. He'd been a founding member of the Buffalo Historical Society, helped establish the University of Buffalo, supported various local institutions, but he hadn't built wealth. What's interesting about Fillmore's financial story is how unremarkable it is. He started poor, worked his way up to middle-class comfort through law and politics, married into some additional wealth later in life, and died comfortably, but not rich. There's no drama, no catastrophe, no con man or debt spiral. Just a guy who worked hard his entire life and ended up okay but not wealthy. Fillmore never accumulated major wealth after the presidency or before it or during it. He was financially successful in the sense that he went from tenant farmer poverty to professional middle-class comfort. That's a real achievement. But it didn't translate into the kind of wealth you'd expect for someone who'd been president of the United States. His story is a reminder that even in the 19th century, even for someone who reached the presidency, upward mobility had limits. You could escape poverty through hard work and talent, as Fillmore did. But that didn't mean you become rich. It meant you become comfortable, secure, respectable. Which is nothing to sneeze at, but it's not wealth. Fillmore came from poverty and never accumulated major wealth, even after reaching the highest office in the land. He died in limited circumstances, not poor, but not rich either, especially considering that much of his late life comfort came from his second wife's inheritance rather than his own accumulation. It's the story of modest success, of making it without making it big, of a life spent working hard and ending up okay. And that, strangely enough, might be the most relatable presidential financial story we've covered so far. Not dramatic collapse or catastrophic debt, just a lifetime of work that led to comfortable but limited means. And that brings us to the end of our journey through presidential poverty, from Jefferson's catastrophic debts to Fillmore's modest means, from Grant's race against death to write his way out of ruin to Madison's slow motion plantation collapse. Here's what strikes me about all these stories: these were some of the most accomplished people in American history. They won wars, wrote constitutions, guided the country through crises, left legacies that lasted centuries. And a lot of them still died broke or close to it, leaving their families dependent on congressional charity and public sympathy. So the next time you're lying awake at 3 a.m. worrying about your retirement account or that impulse purchase you probably shouldn't have made, just remember, Thomas Jefferson died owing the equivalent of millions while his daughter watched everything get sold at auction. Ulysses Grant spent his final months dying of throat cancer while frantically writing to save his family from poverty. James Madison helped invent American democracy and left his widow to sell the family plantation for pennies on the dollar. At least you're not doing that badly. Probably. Sleep tight and be grateful you're not a 19th century president trying to make a tobacco plantation profitable with an economic system built on exhausted soil and moral catastrophe. Sweet dreams.